The Holocaust was the state-sponsored, systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945. Jews were the primary victims. 6 million were murdered. Roma, Gypsies, physically and mentally disabled people, and Poles were also targeted for destruction or decimation for racial, ethnic, or national reasons. Millions more, including homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents, also suffered grievous oppression and death under Nazi tyranny. The Nazi Party came to power in Germany in 1933. The Nazis believed that Germans were members of a biologically superior race, threatened with extinction through the struggle for survival with inferior races. They saw Jews especially as a biological threat to the German Aryan race. Adolf Hitler moved to extend German power in Central Europe, annexing Austria and destroying Czechoslovakia in 1938 to 1939. In the aftermath of the violence of the Kristallnacht pogroms, the Nazis instituted the first systematic roundups of German and Austrian Jews. They deported approximately 30,000 Jewish men to Dachau and other concentration camps after Kristallnacht. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, beginning World War II. Within weeks, the Polish army was defeated. Britain and France declared war on Germany in support of Poland. Under a secret pact with Germany, Soviet forces occupied eastern Poland in 1939, but remained officially neutral in the war until 1941. The Germans killed or resettled hundreds of thousands of Poles in an effort to create new living space for the superior Germanic race. German families settled on the vacant properties. German authorities forced the Jewish population into ghettos, areas of cities where the Jews lived in horrendous squalor under German supervision. During the next 2 years, German forces were victorious, invading Denmark and Norway, the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and France. As German troops neared Paris in June 1940, Italy, Germany's Axis partner, declared war on Britain and France. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, annexed 2 eastern border provinces from Romania, and occupied the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and later Finland and Croatia allied with Germany. In spring 1941, the Axis allies dismembered Yugoslavia and occupied Greece. In June 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union. German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory. This battle was also an ideological battle. Following German combat units, mobile killing squads, Einsatzgruppen, German order police battalions, and other SS units supported by units of the German army slaughtered Jews and other victims in mass shootings. They killed more than 1.5 million Jewish men, women, and children in mass shootings. German police and military authorities also killed Jews in mass shooting operations in occupied Yugoslavia and eastern Poland. Increasing Soviet resistance halted the German advance, preventing the Germans from capturing the key cities of Leningrad and Moscow. A second German offensive in the summer of 1942 brought German forces deeper into Soviet territory, to the southeast, to the Volga River, and into the North Caucasus region. As the German advance stalled in the east, Germany moved to consolidate its dominance in Europe. They also extended in 1942 the systematic killing of Jews to other territories they controlled or occupied. German SS and police officials established killing centers in German-occupied Poland, where the Jewish population was both relatively numerous and densely settled. They deported Jews there, primarily by rail, from all over German-occupied Europe. Carbon monoxide gas, or Zyklon B gas, hydrogen cyanide, were the primary methods of murder. In late 1942 and early 1943, Soviet forces counterattacked and began liberating territory from German domination. In the West, Allied forces invaded Sicily and the Italian mainland that summer. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in northern France, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. Meanwhile, from the east, Soviet forces reached Germany's eastern borders. As the Allies forced German troops to retreat, Allied troops began to encounter tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. In an effort to prevent large numbers of prisoners from falling into the hands of the Allies, the Germans forced the evacuation of many camps, compelling thousands of prisoners to march into the interior of Germany. Prisoners called these forced marches death marches. By the spring of 1945, conditions in the remaining concentration camps exacted a terrible toll in human lives. Overcrowded, filthy, with few supplies, these camps became sites of mass death. Around half of the concentration camp population in January 1945 died before the war's end. World War II ended in Europe with the unconditional surrender of German armed forces in May 1945. In addition to millions of other victims, Nazi Germany and its collaborators murdered close to 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe. Hundreds of Jewish communities in Europe, some centuries old, disappeared forever in the massive crime we now call the Holocaust.
We know this because of a recent study done by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, which is also called the Claims Conference. Now, before the report, we only had vague ideas of how many survivors were left in the world. About 49% of them, almost half, live in Israel. 16% are living in the United States, 18% are in Western Europe, and 12% in the countries of the former Soviet Union. Now, the numbers in the report are interesting, but it's also very important to look past those numbers at the actual people those numbers represent. The average age of a Holocaust survivor today is 86 years old, which means that most were children during the Holocaust. Each one of them is a bridge across the water of time to another place. And those bridges are disappearing too quickly. Tonight we'll be taken to a place where we will see things as they happen through the eyes of a 13-year-old girl waving goodbye to her father, wondering if she would ever see him again. And we'll see him looking back at her tearfully, wondering if he would ever see her again. There are excellent books about the Holocaust written by survivors. I'm sure all of you have read some of them. But nothing can substitute for hearing about it firsthand. So we thank you tonight for taking the time to be here, and we're honored by your presence, as we are Margot Goldberg's. I have just a couple of housekeeping things. You have a piece of paper on your seat. These are for questions. We're going to do a Q&A at the end of Margot's presentation, and I encourage you to ask anything you'd like. They will be ferried up to the stage here, and I'll ask you those questions. But at this time, I'd like to welcome to the stage Rabbi Yossi Goldberg.
My name is Yossi Grossbaum, Rabbi Yossi Grossbaum. I run the Chabad Jewish Community Center here in Folsom together with my wife Goldie. And tonight we are honored to host this event together with Chabad of Placer County. Rabbi Korek is here as well. And we are privileged to be able to do these events, primarily because there's limited opportunities to do these type of events. And we're honored that you all came to join us here tonight. And if there's any message that I want you to go home with tonight, it's not only the events that we're remembering, but it's also what it can mean for us. What should we do about it? And there's a lot of people that have a lot of different ideas what you could do about it, but I want to share with you 2 brief episodes that happened where individuals who themselves survived the Holocaust suggested what we can learn from it. One is a rabbi who was with the US military. Right after the liberation of the camps, there was an opportunity to provide religious services for many of the survivors who, for years, have been in camps, deprived of every physical need, but also deprived of all their spiritual needs. So this rabbi came from America, and he's encouraging Jews to participate. These Jews had gone through hell on earth. And one of them comes over to him and says, I will not step foot into a Jewish service ever again in my life. He said, why? When I was in the camp, I saw people who had the last piece of bread, and they were buying an opportunity to use a prayer book with their last piece of bread. I can't believe it. Who would have the audacity to take a prayer book and sell the ability to pray for someone's last piece of bread? So the rabbi responded to him, big question, what do you do with that? So he says to him, you know, you're looking at the wrong side of the story. You're looking at the side of the story of the individual who had the prayer book and was selling the opportunity to use it for the last piece of bread. Why don't you look at all of those people who are willing to give their very last piece of bread for an opportunity to connect to God, for an opportunity to pray? Later that night, when the service started, Shabbat started, this individual was part of the crowd. I think we can remember, sometimes when you're comfortable, we start looking for ways to make ourselves more comfortable. When we're in a state of deprivation, we start looking for ways to help others. Rabbi Finkel was a head of a yeshiva in Israel. He himself was a survivor of the Holocaust. And someone here must have heard of, there's a company, you may have heard of it before, it's a small company called Starbucks. Someone's heard of it, right? So the founder of Starbucks, an individual, his name is Howard Schultz. He was on a mission to Israel a number of years ago with a group of other American businessmen. And they met with this Rabbi Tzvi Finkel, and they're listening to his story of survival, and they asked him, what should we do? We're here, we have resources, what can we do to help? He said, well, let me tell you what I experienced in the camps. We were on these shelves that were supposed to be beds. That's where we slept, 5, 6 people to each section. And they would give one blanket per group, per section, 5, 6 people for one blanket. And he said, you would imagine that everyone was deprived, they didn't have any food, they didn't have any, barely clothes. They had a blanket. So you would think that everyone would be trying to grab the blanket for themselves. And he said instead, everyone was trying to spread the blanket out so as many people as possible could benefit from that blanket. That blanket could cover more than one person. He says, you have large, heavy blankets. Go back to America, spread your blanket as far and as wide as possible. I think while it's extremely important for us to remember the events of the Holocaust, it's extremely important that we make sure that these events don't take place again. The way to do that is to ensure that we look out for our neighbors, we look out for our friends, we look out for people that might be in a situation that's less positive than what we are experiencing. If someone is suffering, if someone is hurting, if someone is lacking, we have the ability to help, even by reaching out and showing that we care. We should take our blanket and spread it to as many people as we can. As I mentioned, tonight's event is also sponsored by the Chabad of Placer County, and it's my honor to ask Rabbi Korik to introduce tonight's speaker and to thank tonight's sponsors as well.
Thank you. Thank you everyone who made the effort to attend tonight's important event. I want to take this opportunity to thank the sponsors who helped make this event possible. Farmers Insurance, Wechsner Insurance and Financial Services, Style Media Group, Breakmasters, Gorgeous Architecture, Republic's Risk Mitigation, Scott Ewell Insurance and Financial Services, and Law Office of Marcus LaDuca. I also want to thank all the volunteers who helped at the front table And I want to thank our volunteer photographers here, Don Murray and Chaim, as well as our videographer, Mark Rauch. It is my distinct honor to introduce tonight's speaker. I have the privilege to have known her for many, many years. She's a very strong and powerful woman with a lot of courage, with a lot of wisdom, and an incredible amount of life experience that she will share with us. And I just want to share that she mentioned to me about 2 months ago, in her words, this is the second Holocaust that I'm living through. So this time and this message and this conversation is all that much more important in the times that we're living through right now. It is my honor and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Mrs. Margot Goldberg.
Thank you all for coming. I have some slides I wanted to show. I'm not sure where they are. Rabbi, do you know about the slides?
Our tech team is working on it.
Okay, this is the first one, and the reason I have it here is not to insult your intelligence, but I speak to school groups quite often, and surprisingly, many of the students, like 6th and 7th grade, have no idea where Germany is. So I decided to put a map in there right up front so that they can get their bearings of where they are. Next slide, please. This is my mother. And next slide, please. And my father. Both the pictures were taken like passport pictures, so it doesn't really show them at their best. What you cannot see, oops, don't want to fall off the stage. What you cannot see is a little handkerchief my father has in his breast pocket. I went with him to take this picture at a photographer's studio, and I said, oh, you're not fully dressed, you need a little handkerchief in your breast pocket. So I pulled out my little white handkerchief with green and pink flowers around the edge and put it in his breast pocket. And it does unfortunately not show in this picture, but I treasure this handkerchief a great deal. I used to take it with me when I spoke. I decided to make it more permanent, and I had it framed, so I don't have it with me tonight. Next picture, please. My brother, when he was 2 years old, my brother was 2 years older than I was. No, he was 6 months older. He was 2 years older than I am, and this is probably his first picture. You know, in those days, people didn't have cameras on their telephones that they carried around, so taking a picture was more of an event. There's no picture of me when I was 6 months old, and as my youngest daughter claims, nobody took her picture till she was 10, which is not quite true. But this is my brother. Next picture, please. This is the four of us, my brother and I, and my cousins, Ken and Rudy. They were actually second cousins, but we grew up like brother-sister. And obviously we were all dressed up here for something that went on at the seashore. I think I was about 4 years old at the time. My brother was 6, and Ken was also 6, and Rudy was about 10 years old. So next picture, please. This is quite a famous picture in the town where I was born, in Dusseldorf. This is my grandfather, Isaac, my grandmother, Eva, and they were my father's parents. On the right is my father, Arthur. In the center is my uncle, Adolf. And of course, nowadays, Jews don't name their children Adolf anymore. They were born in, my father was born in 1888. So, and then on the left is his youngest brother, Eugene. Eugene was one of the, Uncle Eugene was one of the first people, one of the few people who managed to survive. And now he has passed away now, of course, but they lived in England. Next picture, please. This is Uncle Adolf sitting on his horse during the First World War. He was in the cavalry, which was kind of an elite group, kind of like the Marines. And unfortunately, he was killed in the last week of the war in 1918. My grandparents had this picture done in oils. It was hanging up on the wall in our house, actually. And when the destruction began, my grandmother, by that point, my grandparents were living with us. My grandmother said, "Oh, please, this is a picture of my son. He died in the war." And one of the invaders pulled out a gun and shot through the picture. Next picture, please. This is my brother's bar mitzvah. You see in the back there, my brother and I. And my father's on the left, my mother's on the right. Can't really see from there. From the far right is our rabbi, Rabbi Shabbat. And so it was a lunch that we had for my brother's bar mitzvah in our house. At that time, it was in 1938, you could still, 1937, you could still do this kind of gathering in homes, which of course later you could not do. Next picture, please. This is a new car. My grandfather was very proud of it. He was standing next to it. And in the little car is my little cousin Jerry, who's in his 90s now. He's not in, and he was about 4 or 5 there. My Uncle Eugene. And as I told you, I showed pictures to schools. And the biggest reaction I got from one boy said, "Wow, a Mercedes. You still have that car?" I said, "No, it would be a little too old by now." Next picture, please. And this is my brother, and we were doing, my brother and I, we were doing a dance for my grandparents' golden wedding. And this part I remember about that is my braids, which of course was a wig. I wanted so much to have long hair, but my mother wouldn't let me keep the wig. My brother, of course, is super handsome. He was super handsome all his life. He was like movie star handsome. So next picture, please. And this is another picture of family gathering. This is the golden wedding anniversary of my grandparents. And you can get kind of an idea of what a huge family we had. In those days, people had many children. My grandmother came from a one of 7, and so did the other grandparents. So most of these people, unfortunately, did not survive. But our house seemed to be somewhat of a gathering place. So they would, not all of them at once, but people would come. We would have guests every Sunday afternoon for afternoon coffee. And of course, I could not remember. What is this uncle's name? What is this aunt's name? I wasn't very good at it. Still not good at remembering names. So my brother would be my shadow, and he would say, he would whisper to me, "This is Uncle Otto, and this is Uncle Will," and so on. But every Sunday afternoon, people came for coffee. Next picture, please. This is our synagogue in Dusseldorf. It's a beautiful building. It's the outside. And of course, it was burned down to the ground in Kristallnacht. Next picture, please. And this is the inside of the building. You can see in the center there with the beautiful curtain alcove. This is where the Torahs were kept. When the ark was opened any time, everyone rose with respect to the Torah and remained standing until the ark was closed again. During Kristallnacht, the Torahs inside were removed and put in a pile in the street and let on fire. And some people danced around. Next picture, please. This of course, is the ruins of our synagogue. Not even that much was standing in the end. It was all gone. And next picture, please. This is our house at Dusseldorf. The area on the left there was where the front door was once, where the front door was. This picture was taken by my cousin Ken, who was in the British Army, and Dusseldorf was in the British zone of Germany. And so he was in Dusseldorf and he took this picture. Of course, it was totally destroyed. Next picture, please. Oh, okay. What I was going to point out, hard to see from here, but you see kind of a bay window. And this was our family room downstairs. And when my father went during Kristallnacht, was taken to prison, I sat in this bay window for 3 days, waiting for him to come out. I would see him walking down. I was hoping to see him walking down the street. Of course, he did eventually come out, but not after 3 days. So, next picture, please. I believe this is the final picture. My grandmother Eva on the right. This is my father's mother. Her sister Julie, and her 5 brothers. And these probably, of all the visitors we have had every Sunday, were the most constant ones. And I still couldn't remember every uncle's name. My brother was there to help me. So I think that's the next one. That's the final picture, right? Yeah, no more pictures. So, as I mentioned before, I've spoken to quite a few groups. I've been to Germany several times at their invitation, and spoken to groups. And I have to tell you a very unusual story. At one trip, this was at the invitation of Dusseldorf, of the city of Dusseldorf, and they limited the group to 20 people because they showed us around. So there were 20 of us, and we were asked if we wanted to go to a high school and speak. And 4 of the 20 people expressed an interest in doing that, and I was one of them. So we were in groups of 2. We went to 4 different high school classes or high schools. And for all of us, there was only one photographer present from the newspaper. Several newspapers, people were present, but only one photographer. The photographer chose to go with my group. And this whole story is a series of coincidences, if you believe in coincidences. So the photographer came with us, and we had, after a while, no household help, German household help, could be in Jewish homes. So after a while, we were left with a housekeeper who was Dutch, and she was allowed to stay there. So she was in a home, and I had already left for England at that time, so I didn't really know her very well. And so the other person and I went to the high school, and the photographer took pictures, and later in the day, or the next day, the pictures and the articles appeared in the local paper. The daughter of our former housekeeper saw this picture and wondered if it was really a picture of me. So bottom line is, we got together, she picked me up, they took me to her mother, who was dying of cancer, and I talked to the mother for 2 hours, and then I could tell she was fading. And in the end, she confused me with my mother. She thought I was my mother. So I knew it was time to go, but it was a really shattering experience for me to meet this woman totally by coincidence. And 6 months after we met, she did pass away. So it's an incredible story that this should happen when you don't expect anything like that. And let's see. I wrote down a few words that I wanted to talk about, so I didn't forget anything important. First of all, I want to mention that the Germans, of course, were unbelievably, the horror was unbelievable. The people who were responsible for it were cruel, and a lot of them, the difference was that a lot of these were educated people, and their cruelty was just unbelievable. My grandfather was a great philanthropist. He gave to all Jewish causes, and he gave to city causes. So he was well known in Dusseldorf. He started a business and really worked it into a very successful enterprise. He owned property all over town, and he was apparently, and I learned all these things later, of course. When you're 13, you don't know these. He was a great philanthropist. And this was unusual, he paid medical care. He had medical care for all his employees, which I know is normal now, it wasn't at that time. He put his secretary's son through college, and he was such a beloved person in the city that during Kristallnacht, it took quite a while for whoever they were, to gather together 10 men to break into houses. They wouldn't come at first. But then in the end, they did come. They stormed into our house. They broke down the front door, although we would have opened it, and immediately began to destroy. The first question they asked is, and of course they knew who we were, where's your daughter? So my mother had the foresight to put me into her room, to bed in her room. So they left that room alone. They said, we will not destroy the room where a child is, which was a special privilege they obviously extended to us that they did not extend to many others. So then they went into our kitchen, and I remember, and I'm sure some of you do if you're old enough, before electric refrigerators, we had like big tubs, and the iceman came a couple of times a week with huge blocks of ice. But we had an electric refrigerator, so it was not a normal thing to have. And as they broke into our kitchen and started to destroy, pulling out plates and dishes and everything, the refrigerator started up its little humming noise, and they got scared, and they turned away, and they walked out. So we had in our house, it's a pretty big house, we had 1 bedroom and half a kitchen. So, and of course, after the invaders left our house on Kristallnacht, my mother stood among the rubble of all her beautiful china, all her beautiful glass, all the things that the children, that we were allowed to look at but not to touch. She loved all her stuff. So she stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the broken glass, the broken china, and all these things that she treasured. And she said, and I remember those words because it kind of stayed with me. She said, "It doesn't matter because we're all here." And then, unfortunately, about 2 hours later, they came back. They took my father and my grandfather, who was 80 at that time, to prison. And my father they released my grandfather after about 3 days because, I guess, of his age. They released my father after 6 weeks, and he was one of the first group to be released because he was in the First World War. And and as I mentioned earlier, I sat in the window for 3 days, but he came home after 6 weeks. And I remember this very distinctly. It must have been late at night because I was sleeping, and he came in and sat by where I was sleeping, and he was very dirty. The first thing he wanted to do was to see me. Before he washed, before anything. He was very dirty. His hair he was bald, his hair was shorn, and he was very thin, but he was home. So that was incredible for me that finally he did come home. He was also under orders to leave the country as soon as possible. Unfortunately, they were not able to do that. After Kristallnacht, things became much more serious and much more stringent in Germany. In Germany at that time, when children became 10 years old, they had the choice, or rather their parents had the choice, of whether they should continue their education in a grade school until they were 14, or if they should strive to go to higher learning and until 16 and then go on to college. So I had been enrolled in one of the girls' high schools to start on that college journey. And by the time it was time to go for classes to start, I could no longer go. Jews were not allowed. So the only high school that would take me in, the Jews were not allowed in private schools or in public schools. The only high school that had the freedom to do what they wanted was a group of nuns who ran a high school, a convent, and they accepted me as a student. And these nuns were incredibly wonderful. They did everything they could to make my life happy at school. They had special set up for me in the library if I wanted to go there when they were going through Mass and through other church services. Unfortunately, after 1 year of that, the state took over and threw the nuns out. And the nuns offered to take my mother and me with them because they were going into hiding. And my mother wouldn't go because she wouldn't leave my father. So, but this was a really great experience to be in that school. But there were consequences when it became a state school. I had kids following me home from school, taking my books, taking my hat and my gloves and whatever, and throwing them in the gutter and just stomping on them. I also got a horrible report card for the first part of the school year, and I was a good student. I was used to getting A's. My parents were proud of me, and all I could think about was, what is my father going to say to this report that shows all D's or failures? And we were so protected from my parents that we didn't really, at least I didn't, I think my brother understood more, but I didn't really understand what was happening. that this was not a real report on what I had done. But I was crying all the way home, took it to my father, and said, I'm sorry, but I failed everything. And he tore it up, and he said, doesn't have anything to do with you. So, and he also said, you're not going back to that school. So I didn't. So the only option available to us at all was to go into the quickly established Jewish school. And there were quite a few children, only 3 classes, because only 3 teachers were left. So we didn't really learn anything much, but we were in a safe environment that was a school. We did learn to speak Hebrew, and unfortunately I've forgotten everything, but we did learn to speak and to write it, so that was a good part of that. Let's see. And as I said before, there were other good people in Germany. They weren't all bad. For instance, like the nuns, they were wonderful. We had a little ice cream store at close to us where we lived. And the woman, and of course they had a sign in the window like everybody else, Jews are not allowed. And the woman would see my brother and I coming down the street. My brother and she would motion us to the back alley, and she would hand us both a sweet. So there were some people who did not agree with what was happening, but they were also afraid for their own lives, because any indication that they were helping Jews would immediately put them in prison. We had a driver for our business, and he came to our house one night very late, and he wanted to take my father over the board into Holland, into Holland. And my father wouldn't go because he wouldn't leave his mother. But it probably would have saved his life if he had gone. My father felt he had a big obligation to his parents, my grandparents, because he was the oldest son. And that's why it was very late for him to even start thinking of leaving. But then, of course, he was under orders to leave, so he had no choice. But as I said, unfortunately, that did not happen. So I was sent on the kindertransport, and of course, my brother never came back from school. He went to I didn't mention that. My parents sent him to England to a boys' boarding school in 1938 in the fall, and because by that time they could see the danger that he was in, and my father took him, but he was obligated to come back unless he wanted my mother and I to go to prison or worse. So he came back. This was in September 1938, and then of course Kristallnacht happened in November 1938, so my brother was never able to come back for any vacation. So he never saw my parents again either. At the time, my mother didn't want him to know that my father was in prison, so she would fake his handwriting on letters and pretend he had written the letters. And I don't know if he ever knew they were written by her. She was not a very good letter faker. So that was, and of course that also triggered my leaving for England. I was fortunate enough to get a place on a kindertransport, which was a program from the British government that saved children. Children were allowed to come up to age 18 without their parents. So, and only one parent, and this of course was a German order, only one parent was allowed to take the child to the railroad station. So my father took me to the station, put me on the train with all the other children, and as the train pulled out, as the train pulled out, I watched him and he was crying. And I'd never seen my father cry. And that was the last I saw of him, and of my parents, and of my grandparents. My grandmother had a stroke during Kristallnacht, from which she never recovered. She died at the end of 1939. So she lived in another year, but she never recovered from her stroke. She could never talk. My grandfather eventually was sent to Theresienstadt, and this wonderful, wonderful man was starved to death within 1 week. One of my grandfather's biggest pleasures was to after Shabbat services, after Saturday morning services, he would take my brother and me and walk down. Dusseldorf was a beautiful city. The downtown had kind of like a parkway in the middle of the two-way street, one side on the right, one side going the other way, and in the middle there was a strip of grass and fountains and things like that. My grandfather's biggest pleasure, or one of his biggest pleasures, was to take my brother and me to a coffee house and buy us hot chocolate with whipped cream, which we were not allowed to have at home because we were kind of getting a little fat. So my mother wouldn't have allowed that, but she knew better than to say he couldn't do that. So this was one of his biggest pleasures, this wonderful man who was such a philanthropist and such a big person in the city. So I think I pretty well covered everything I wanted to say. Of course, you know, I could talk for another hour, but I don't want that, and I don't want it. So thank you very much for being here and for listening, and I hope I'll be able to answer your questions, and wish you all a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and a wonderful year. And thank you.
Test, test. Okay. Thank you so much, Margot. If you have questions that you wrote down during her remarks, you can pass them to the edges of the aisle, and someone will run by and grab those. I'll start with a few of my own questions. When we talked on the phone, we did an interview before this event, and when we talked on the phone, you told me that when you got on the train to leave, and you waved goodbye to your father, there were other parents there, and you saw one of them pull their child off the train.
No, I actually did not see that. I heard about it later from a very reliable source. Yeah, he could not bear to see his daughter leave, and he pulled her out through the window, and of course, with the daughter, neither one of them survived. So my parents had incredible courage to send me away at the age of 13, when children, especially little girls, really need their mothers and their fathers. And by doing that, they saved my life. Yeah.
When you were on the train and you were heading out of Germany, you described to me how the train broke down. Tell me about what happened.
Okay, when we got to the border, the train stopped. The Nazis, of course, came on board to make sure that they'd stolen everything they could from the children. And the train stopped because it had some kind of a problem, and at that time I realized, at first I thought I'm going on a big adventure and my parents are going to follow. But then I realized pretty soon after that was not going to happen. So all I wanted was for the train to get stuck there and send us back home. And of course that didn't happen either. And then we finally crossed the border into Holland.
Describing all of these wonderful family gatherings and seeing all of this happen through the eyes of a child your parents seemed to be trying so hard to keep things normal as they could be for everything that was happening. When did you first notice something's wrong? Something's not right. Society's not right. What was the first thing that you noticed that gave you a clue that something was going wrong?
Well, of course, when it didn't bother me so much that I couldn't get into the high school because I had such a wonderful year with the nuns in the convent. But then when the school was taken over by the state, and as I mentioned, I got a report card with all failures. And my father, instead of saying, "Oh, why did you get such a report card?" he tore it up and he was very angry and said, "You're not going back." And I think that's when I realized really how serious the situation was getting. And then, of course, but kids do that anyway. They tease others and take their books. But yeah, they were little things and they kind of build up together.
How did you find out what eventually became of your family? How did you find all of that out?
There's an agency in Dusseldorf where I was born and lived that traces all former Jewish residents and knows as much about them as they can find out. And apparently there was a witness to my parents getting on a bus to the death camp. And of course, everybody on the bus was gassed. So instead of arriving as people at the death camp, they arrived as bodies. And there was a witness who survived that.
How old were you when you found all of that out? And what were you telling yourself as a child as you were living your life outside of Germany about your family? Did you eventually believe that you would see them again?
Yes, I always believed I would see them again. We found out for sure, probably, I was at least 16, I might have been a little bit older. And I didn't really go into, when I was talking, I didn't really go into what happened to me in England because it's kind of a long story. But the first family I lived with really didn't want me. They were really very, very nasty to me. Under some pretense of caring, they asked me, they kept prodding me, "What food don't you like? What don't you like to eat?" So when I finally said, "I don't like to eat fish," what did they serve every night? Fish. Then the lady, after dinner, brought out a plate of cookies and put them in the living room. And there were 2 children in the family, one older and one younger than ours. And they kind of dived onto the cookies, and I did too, because I was hungry. I didn't eat any fish. And she kind of swatted me away and said, "This is only for children who eat their dinner." So, yeah, it was a difficult time.
A question from the audience. What happened to your brother? How did you get your family pictures, all of the pictures you were able to show?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I can't really answer it. My cousin Rudy, who was the older of the 2 boys with whom we were actually raised together, was a great researcher. And this was all before computers. He did all his research the way he always did, go to the library, go to this, go to that. And I think he actually was the person who found most of the pictures. Where he found them, I don't know. The only pictures I have were the 2 pictures I showed you, one of my father and one of my mother. The others, I'm not sure where they came from, but I think most of them came from my cousin.
And what happened to your brother?
My brother had to leave the school, the boys' school. It was in Tiverton, which is on the southern coast of England, because England was afraid, which didn't make much sense at the time, or doesn't make much sense to me now, that we were German and we would do something to encourage an invasion. So he had to leave his school. He went to live with my Uncle Eugene, who managed to get to England. And we didn't see each other for quite a long time because I didn't have stamp, he didn't have any money. We couldn't even write to each other. But eventually, of course, we got beyond that point and we reconnected. I came to this country and I talked my brother into following me, which he did. Unfortunately, he got stuck in New York. He never moved farther than that. But still, we were, you know, by this time we could talk to each other, we could write to each other, we could see each other. So my brother, of blessed memory, passed away 6 years ago. The way he probably loved, if he had to go, the way to go. He was ready to stand up at a luncheon. He was supposed to speak. And he fell over, and that was it. So, for him, it was the best way to go. For us, not so much. And I have to say, I miss it every day. I keep thinking of, I need to ask him this, and then I realize he's not there. But we did connect. We had a very close relationship.
Did your, got me a mic, so we're both good to go. Did your views change on the world after the Holocaust?
I'm sorry, what?
Did your views on the world and the goodness of the world change after the Holocaust?
I don't think so. I was mostly busy surviving. After my experiences in England for about 2.5 years, I did meet a girl at high school, and we became very, very good friends. And she and her family invited me to live with them. So after living with some difficult people, I lived in a normal family with people who were wonderful to me, treated me like another daughter. And my friend Marjorie and I stayed friends forever. She unfortunately passed away 7 years ago. No, 4 years ago. 4 years ago. I went to the funeral, which was at Canterbury Cathedral. I gave the eulogy, and so we were, that really saved her family saved my sanity. Yeah.
Did you get to know anyone on the train? When you were on the train heading out, did you talk to other children?
Not really, no. I think everyone was too busy with her own grief and her own expectations. And I know some people didn't really know where they were going in England. I did know that because the school that sponsored me had picked out families for me to live with. Unfortunately, not always the best families or the kindest family or some horrible families, but I did have a place to go. So no, we didn't really talk to each other.
Have you ever returned to Dusseldorf? Have you ever gone?
Oh yes, I've been back several times, and at their invitation. As I mentioned earlier, the one time was when we went with a photographer to a high school. They are extremely hospitable. The town of Dusseldorf has a recent new technical college that is one building is totally devoted to the Holocaust. And they invited me, I spoke there. I spoke to not just the high school, but an open meeting. So I've been there several times, and I'm in correspondence with actually I guess the dean of the Holocaust part of that university. And you know, he keeps saying, when are you coming? When are you coming? So, yes, I've been in correspondence with them. I have no ill feeling toward this generation. They weren't alive when this happened. And really, Germans are doing the best they can to atone, which of course is impossible, but they're doing the best. So I have no ill feeling toward the individuals. Germans as a group may be a different matter. If I hear some Germans speak amongst themselves, I walk away. I don't want to hear it. So it's a mixed bag.
Do you speak the language?
Enough to be able to speak to them in German. the first time I went to this high school classroom, and there were cameras set all around the room, and the newspaper reporters were there en masse. And I thought, oh my God, what am I doing here? And my German was a little halting, but surprisingly, after a day or so, it all came back. And yeah, I do speak to them in German. Even though they speak very good English in high schools, they wanted me to speak in English, because I could learn more. And I said, no, I'm speaking in German. So yeah, I do.
Did you bring any family mementos with you when you left on kindertransport? Did you take anything, a doll, a toy, something?
No, I didn't take anything. I took the handkerchief my father used in his breast pocket. I didn't take anything, really. I took one, well, that's not exactly right. I took a gold chain that my grandmother had made from the uncle who was killed in the war, her middle son. She had made it into a necklace, and she gave it to me, and of course I still have that. And somebody, not sure who, gave me a gold bracelet to take, and I have that. But really, nothing much. You were limited in what you could take.
You described the night of Kristallnacht and how you were in a bedroom. You were in a room?
Yeah, I was in the bedroom until they left, and then my mother came and took me out. And then of course, I was there when they came back a few hours later and took my father and my grandfather to prison. And then the next day, the people, neighbors, my mother, my aunt, were sitting on either the floor or whatever furniture they could find in our house, and just stunned into silence. And my cousin Ken said to me, let's clean up. So he and I started cleaning up all the broken pieces, get rid of the broken furniture, and so forth. So that gave us something to do. But no, my grandmother stayed in the room, in my parents' room, until she died. As I said, she never got up, she never even spoke for a year until she died.
Has your relationship with religion changed?
No.
Have you had to deal with survivor guilt? If so, how did you deal with this?
I don't feel I have any guilt. I went through hell, excuse the expression. I don't have any guilt, no. I went through a hard time. I was determined to survive, and I have to tell you, it makes you into a tough girl, and that's what I became.
When did you come to the United States, and what was that circumstance?
Okay, in 1945, the war was over in May 1945, and toward the end of the year, I went and I had to take a really tough test, which I was lucky to pass. You were only allowed 2 failures on 10 questions. I mean, 1 failure on 10 questions. I would have had 2, but fortunately I had just read a book about Woodrow Wilson, and I knew the answers to the question. It was a miracle. As I said, another coincidence. And so I was accepted with the United States Army as an interpreter, and our first station, we could choose between Berlin and Frankfurt, and I chose Berlin, and I was there for a year and a half. And then in the meantime, I applied for a visa to come to this country, and then I left to come to the country.
This is a question you hear often, so I'm curious your answer to it. I've heard several. People often ask, how was it that so few Germans controlled so many Jews before the concentration camps? Why didn't the Jewish citizens fight back?
They did at one point fight back. There was an uprising against Hitler, which unfortunately failed. And one reason I think they were afraid to fight back is that anybody seen being sympathetic to Jews, was treated the same way as the Jews were. Prison, concentration camp, death. And in some way it's understandable that they didn't want to risk that. So, you know, it was an age where there was not the news information that's so easily obtainable now. So people only knew part of what was going on, but they knew enough to be afraid for their lives. I don't like it.
The first time you went back to Dusseldorf, was it hard to be there again?
No, not really. The first time I went back to Germany with the U.S. Army group, that was hard. When I saw the German prisoners on docks, unloading ships and things like that. I said, I can't do this, but you know, he said, well, stay a few days and then talk to me again. So, no, by the time I went back to Dusseldorf, no, I was kind of excited to see what was there. And as I said, they treated me like royalty. They still do, they always do.
Did you go to your old home? Did you go to
Oh, yes.
places you remembered?
Oh, yes, yes. I would near our old home, which was bombed during the war and razed subsequently, and built in its place was kind of an ugly house. So it really was kind of a bittersweet feeling about it. I went to our business, the place where our business was, where my grandparents lived. Yes, and it brought things back, and it was quite traumatic, quite upsetting. But as I said, by this time, I was a pretty tough girl. I could take it.
This person wants to know, and you've mentioned you did not hear from your parents after you left the country. Did you get any news while you were in England about your parents until you went looking for news?
Yes, I left in June. I left Germany in June of 1939, and the war broke out in August of 1939, or August or September, I'm not sure. And during those few months, we could correspond fairly often. My mother even sent me a little cake, and when it arrived at the first family I stayed with, who were Zelensky people, the woman said, "Does she think we don't feed you?" And she took the little cake and threw it in the restaurant. And, but then after the war broke out, our only correspondence was through the Red Cross, and you could send 25 words once a month. So, you know, what do you say? I never told them about the horrible time I had in England. I said, everything is wonderful. The family is so nice to me. And, you know, why should I worry them and tell them what I'm living through? And they said the same thing. Everything is wonderful here, and you know it wasn't.
How long did you have to stay with those horrible people?
When I've been there 6 months, the lady's father died. And her mother died. Well, one of them died. And I think must have been her mother. Her father was going to move in with him, and they needed my room. So they sat me down and said, unfortunately, you're going to have to leave. So I burst into tears. There were tears of relief and gratitude. They thought there were tears I was crying because I had to leave them. So that was 6 months.
How many families did you bounce around with?
Well, after that, I went to live with a pastor of a church, and he had agreed to take me for 3 months, and then his inner voice told him that wasn't good enough. He had to keep me for 6 months. So 6 months to the day I was out of there. But he was not nice to me, but he was equally not nice to his own children. There were 3 girls. The oldest one was a year younger than I was. And then they had a little boy who was 2, very sweet little boy. And the whole household, the mother, the father, and the housekeeper, adored this little boy and did not particularly like the three girls.
How did you end up with people who didn't care for you? I mean, was there a financial incentive for them to take you?
There was a very small financial incentive per week. It probably covered my food, maybe, you know. So I think some people expected to have a sweet little obedient girl coming, and I wasn't that. So they were probably disappointed. And then the people afterwards I stayed with, they got nicer. Things got nicer as it progressed. They were very nice to me. It was unfortunately the height of the Blitz, air raid shelters underground every night. And the woman, the lady, was a very nervous woman, and she was very upset about being responsible for me. And so, you know, but they were very nice to me. I can't complain. And then the last family before Marjorie was probably the poorest family, if you want to call it that. The father was a coal miner. The mother ran a little shop, like a little grocery store. And they didn't have much, but they were very nice to me. The only disadvantage there was the daughter was a year younger than I was, and she was kind of boy crazy. And she also skipped school more than she went. So they kept saying to her, why can't you be like Margot? Why can't you do this? That did not go over very well. So then, fortunately, Marjorie came along, and I stayed with her family till we graduated high school.
This person wants to know, did you ever come to peace with what happened? Is this something that it's taken a lifetime for you to process? Did you ever come to peace with what happened?
Have to what?
With all the things that happened to you in your life, have you come to peace about it?
Mostly. Yeah, you can't forget, and you can't change anything. So, so this is why I think when the rabbi asked me to speak, I said, yes, I will, even though I wasn't sure I could. And when schools asked me to come, I come, because I want people to know what went on. And I have to say that children are extremely attentive. I talked to a class once on a Friday afternoon. They were real fidgety. They wanted school to be over, have a weekend. And gradually they became so interested that when it was time to go, they said, oh, let's stay another hour. I said, what, Friday afternoon and you want to stay after school? So, yeah, I mean, that's why I do it.
And when did you share your life with your own children?
Not for a very long time. I couldn't talk about it, and they could only fantasize. I know they fantasized that one day there would be a knock on the door and it would be my parents. And of course I knew at that time that was not going to happen. So gradually, things came out and I felt free to talk. And actually at about early 1990s, a local group formed from people from the kindertransport. And the two people who arranged it thought there might be, if they're lucky, 10 people there. Instead, about 30 or 40 people came. And it was like the dam broke open. We all wanted to talk. And I think that was the first time we all finally felt free to talk. Before then, it was just too close to us to live through it. And so my husband knew about it, but it was not his place to talk to the children. So everybody, though, I think went through that same experience. Most people did.
You met your husband here in the United States.
Right.
Okay. Did your father ever talk about what happened to him when he was arrested after Kristallnacht, when he came home? Did he ever talk about it? Do you remember overhearing what he went through?
And the only thing I remember his saying, well, two things I remember his saying, was that they were always hungry, they didn't have enough to eat, and two, that they had no drinking water, so they drank water out of the toilet. That's all I remember.
And they took your grandfather too, right? But he was...
No, I never talked to my grandfather again because I don't know. I don't remember ever talking to him again. Of course, talking is kind of a, at the most you get at the beginning of the war when you could send 25 words once a week, once a month, and I would send that to my parents. And, so I never really talked to him again.
How are you after you do these presentations and talk about this again? It brings up, I'm sure, a lot of memories and feelings, and how are you after these events?
Well, I'm okay. I think about these things anyway from time to time. I don't think about them all day long every day, or even every day, but I do think about them. It brings back good memories and brings back bad memories. So I think the good part outdoes the bad part.
Well, you shared so much of both with us tonight. The pictures were beautiful, and hearing your experiences, the good and the bad, I think were good for everyone to hear. I just kind of described earlier how Holocaust survivors they're bridges to the past, and so we thank you so much for taking us on that journey tonight.
My pleasure to do that, yes.
Margot Goldberg, thank you so much. We want to thank you so much for being here tonight, honoring us with your presence here, your attention, your great questions. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you next year.